I raised my son for 31 years. 3 days after my husband and Appo's funeral, he changed the locks on my own front door and left $20 folded under a flower pot on the porch, like I was a paperboy he was settling up with before moving out of town. 1 year later, that same son would stand in front of 400 people, in a ballroom with his name printed on the seating chart, and beg me, in front of all of them, not to say another word. But I and Appo's am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, on a gray Tuesday morning in March, standing on the porch of the house I had lived in for 38 years, holding a suitcase that didn't and Appo's belonged to me because my son had packed it. End quote, Marcus, end quote. I said, keeping my voice level the way I always did. The way that used to make him roll his eyes as a teenager and call me the calm one like it was an insult. End quote. This is my house. End quote. End quote. It was Dad and Appo's house, end quote, Marcus said. He didn't and Appo's look at me when he said it. He looked at a spot just over my shoulder, at the dogwood tree Walter had planted the year Marcus was born. End quote. And now it and Appo's mine. You know that. We talked about this. End quote. We had not talked about this. We had talked about arrangements in the vague, comforting language people use when they Don and Appo's want to say the true thing out loud. Marcus had said at the funeral reception, holding a plate of finger sandwiches he wasn't and Appo's eating, that he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He had said it with his hand on my shoulder, in front of his wife Diane, in front of the pastor, in front of half the congregation of St. Andrew and Appo's taken care of. I had believed him because I am the kind of woman who believes her children until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore, and even then I am slow. End quote. Where exactly am I meant to go, Marcus? End quote. He shrugged. It was such a small gesture for the size of what it did to me. End quote. You and Appo's got savings. Dad had life insurance. You and Appo's I'll figure it out. You always do. End quote. Diane appeared in the doorway behind him then, arms crossed over a cardigan I had given her for Christmas 2 years before, back when she still pretended to like me. She had a way of standing in doorways that made it clear she considered the space behind her already hers. End quote. We really do need the house empty by Friday, Eleanor, end quote, she said. End quote. We and Appo's got contractors coming. We and Appo's redoing the kitchen before we move the boys in. End quote. The boys. My grandsons. Who I had not been told were moving in until that exact sentence. I looked past her, into the front hall where a wedding photograph of Walter and me used to hang, and saw that it was already gone. In its place was a mirror I didn't and Appo's recognize, gold-framed, the kind Diane liked. I want to tell you that I fought. That I raised my voice, that I made a scene on that porch loud enough for the whole street to hear. That I told my son exactly what I thought of a 31-year-old habit of loving him more than he had ever once earned. I didn't and Appo's I have never been a woman who fights in doorways. My mother taught me that dignity is the one thing nobody can legally take from you, and I intended to keep mine, even standing on my own porch with a stranger and Appo's suitcase in my hand. End quote. I and Appo's I'll be gone by Friday, end quote, I said. Marcus looked relieved. Actual relief. Crossing his face like a held breath let go. That was the moment. Not the locks, not the suitcase, not even the $20 I would find later, tucked under the flower pot with a sticky note that said for gas in Diane and Appo's handwriting. That was the moment I understood something had already broken between us that I would not be able to simply love back into place. End quote. Thanks, Mom, end quote, Marcus said. End quote. I knew you and Appo's. Do you understand? End quote. I did not understand. But I have found in 68 years of living that understanding and surviving are two very different skills, and only one of them is required immediately. I drove to a motel off Route 9 that night, the Sundowner Inn, $26 a night, a bedspread the color of an old bruise, a television that only got 4 channels. I sat on the edge of that bed with my late husband and Appo's watch in my lap, the one thing I had grabbed from the nightstand before Marcus could box it up for donation, and I did not cry. I made a list instead. I have always been a woman who makes lists when the world stops making sense. It was the only inheritance my own mother left me that mattered. Paper and a pen, and the belief that any catastrophe could be broken down into smaller, More manageable catastrophes if you were patient enough to write them out. At the top of the list I wrote a name. Not Marcus and Oppos S. Not Diane and Oppos S. Call Harold Weiss. Harold had been Walter and Oppos' attorney for 30 years and mine in the quiet way that wives are sometimes their husband and Oppos' attorney and Oppos' client without anyone quite saying so out loud. Harold Weiss knew things about my life that my own son did not know. He had known them for a very long time. And on that gray Tuesday night in a motel that smelled like bleach and cigarettes, I decided it was time somebody besides Harold and me remembered what those things were. But that would come later. First, you should know who I was before any of this, who Eleanor Hale had spent 68 years quietly being, while everyone around her, including, it turned out, her own son, assumed she was simply a widow with a modest pension and a garden she was too proud to let go untended. I grew up in a mill town in western Pennsylvania where the river ran the color of rust most of the year, and where a girl and Oppos' future was generally decided by the time she was 17 and generally involved either a factory floor or a husband who worked one. My father repaired sewing machines for a living, meticulous work that paid poorly, and my mother kept the books for 3 different local businesses under the table because nobody in 1962 thought to pay a woman what her arithmetic was actually worth. I was good with numbers. Better than good. I did not understand until I was nearly 30 that this was unusual. I simply thought everyone could look at a column of figures and see, almost like a picture, where the money had gone missing or where it was about to. I married Walter Hale when I was 23. He was not a rich man then. He drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor, and had a laugh that made strangers in diners turn around to see what was so funny. We had almost nothing, and we were, for a handful of years, entirely happy in the specific way that people are happy before life gets complicated by success. Walter had an idea, the kind of idea a man has at 2 in the morning after driving a truck full of produce for 11 hours and watching half of it get thrown away because the distribution routes were built for a world that no longer existed. He wanted to build a smarter way to move food from farms to stores. Fewer stops, less spoilage, better timing. He drew his first diagrams on the back of delivery manifests. I balanced the books on our kitchen table by lamplight after he fell asleep, because somebody had to make sure the dream didn't end Oppos' bankrupt us before it had a chance to work. Nobody remembers this part. That is, in a way, the whole point of my life. Hale Regional Logistics started with $11,000, most of it borrowed against my mother and Oppos' house with her blessing, and a hand-lettered sign Walter nailed to a rented warehouse door himself. I was not the woman standing next to him for the photograph when the local paper ran a small item about the new business in 1974. I was inside doing the payroll because somebody had to, and because in that town in that year a woman and Oppos' name on the paperwork of a business still made bankers nervous. But my name was on the paperwork. That part mattered more than anyone, including Walter for a long time, understood. When we incorporated in 1976, Harold Weiss, fresh out of law school, cheap and grateful for the business, set us up as equal partners 50-50 at my quiet insistence. Walter thought it was sentimental. I told him it wasn't an Oppos' sentiment. It was arithmetic. I had done the books. I knew exactly how much of that company was built on decisions I had made at 2 in the morning while he slept, decisions about which routes to cut and which debts to pay first and which suppliers to trust, and I was not going to spend the rest of my life being a founder and Oppos' wife instead of a founder. The company grew slowly for a decade, then faster, then very fast indeed, the way things sometimes do once the underlying idea turns out to be the right one at the right time. By 1995, Hale Regional Logistics had become Hale Distribution Group, moving freight for grocery chains across 4 states. By 2008, when we took a minority stake public to fund an expansion into cold chain pharmaceutical transport, Hale Distribution was quietly one of the largest privately controlled logistics operations east of the Mississippi, and Walter and I, who still lived in the same modest house we and Oppos' bought in 1979, who still drove unremarkable cars, who still went to the same small Presbyterian church every Sunday, controlled just over 60% of it between us through a family trust that Harold Weiss had structured so carefully that even our own accountants sometimes forgot the full shape of it. We never told the children the real number. That was Walter and Oppos' instinct as much as mine, though for different reasons. Walter believed money changed people before they were ready for it to, and he had grown up poor enough to have seen exactly what that looked like up close, cousins who inherited a little and lost themselves entirely. I believed something similar, but I had an additional reason, one I did not fully admit to myself until much later. I liked very much being underestimated. There is a peculiar freedom in being the woman nobody looks at twice. People tell you the truth when they don and oppose. Think you matter enough to lie to. Marcus and Claire grew up comfortable but not showy. Private school, yes, but no chauffeurs. A nice house, yes, but the same nice house the whole time. Nothing that screamed money the way the neighborhoods 2 towns over did. Walter and I agreed when the children were small that we would tell them everything when they were old enough to have proven through their own choices what kind of people they intended to be with it. Claire proved herself early. She left for college on a partial scholarship she and Oppos. Dee worked hard for despite not needing it, majored in structural engineering, and spent a decade building bridges, literal bridges, county infrastructure projects, before starting her own small firm. She married a schoolteacher named Robert. She called me every Sunday. She never once in 34 years asked her father or me for money, though I know for a fact there were years it would have helped. Marcus proved himself differently. Marcus was charming in the way that made people forgive him things before he and Oppos. Dee finished doing them. He went into finance not because he loved numbers the way I did, but because he loved what numbers could buy. He married Diane Castellano in a wedding that cost more than Walter and I made in our first 3 years of marriage combined, a fact I noted but did not comment on, because I had decided long before that criticizing my son and Oppos' wife was a losing strategy for keeping my son. Walter began quietly showing Marcus more of the business in his final decade, not out of blind trust but because Marcus had asked repeatedly and Walter believed in giving people the chance to become who they said they wanted to be. Marcus took a junior role on Hale and Oppos' finance side. He was competent. He was not, Walter told me once in the particular tired voice he used when he was disappointed but trying not to be, someone who understood that the company had been built by 2 people willing to sleep 4 hours a night for a decade, not by someone and Oppos' last name. Walter died on a Tuesday in January quietly in his sleep, the gentlest possible end to a life that had otherwise been built entirely on effort. I was 70 inches away from him when it happened in the other twin bed we and Oppos' Dee started using after his heart surgery, and I did not wake up in time to say goodbye, which is a grief I have made a kind of uneasy peace with, the way you make peace with a scar that aches sometimes in cold weather. At his funeral 400 people came. Employees who had worked for Hale Distribution for 30 years. Suppliers. A state senator who had known Walter since they were boys. I stood at the front of that church in a black dress I had owned for a decade, next to my son and my daughter, and I thought with a clarity that surprised me even in my grief, that Walter had left me something enormous and mostly invisible, and that I was going to have to decide now entirely alone what kind of woman I intended to be with it. 3 days later Marcus changed the locks. The Sundowner Inn did not improve on further acquaintance. I stayed there 11 nights, long enough to learn the schedule of the ice machine down the hall and the name of the night clerk, a kind young man named Desmond who was putting himself through community college and who, on my 4th night, brought me a cup of coffee without being asked and told me, apropos of nothing, that his own grandmother had been put in a nursing home by an uncle who wanted her house, and that he was sorry, whatever had happened to me, that it had happened. I did not tell Desmond who I was. I did not tell anyone who I was for a while because I was still working out in those 11 nights, exactly what had happened and exactly what I intended to do about it. I called Harold Weiss on the 2nd day. End quote, Eleanor, end quote. His voice on the phone had the particular warmth of a man who had known you for 40 years and had also, more than once, watched you cry in his office without either of you acknowledging it directly. End quote, I heard about the house. Marcus called me. End quote. End quote, did he? End quote, I kept my voice even. Whatever was coming, I wanted to hear it clearly, without the static of my own anger in the way. End quote, what did he say? End quote. End quote. He said you and Oppos' Dee agreed to move out while they renovated. He wanted to know how quickly he could formally transfer the deed into his name. End quote. I sat very still on the edge of that bruise-colored bedspread. End quote. The deed is in the family trust, Harold. It has been since 1998. Marcus doesn't and Oppos' have the authority to transfer anything. End quote. End quote. I told him that. End quote. A pause, the particular pause of a lawyer choosing his next sentence carefully. End quote. Eleanor, he seemed to believe he already had that authority. He referenced a document. He said you signed it at Walter and Appo's bedside near the end. Something about a temporary power of attorney for medical decisions that he said had been broadened. End quote. I closed my eyes. I remembered the document. I remembered signing something in the hospital during Walter and Appo's last week, exhausted, grieving in advance in that particular way you grieve someone who is still technically alive, while Marcus stood beside me with papers and a pen, saying this just lets me help with the medical stuff, Mom, so you Don and Appo's have to deal with insurance calls on top of everything. I remembered trusting him because he was my son and because I did not, in that specific week of my life, have the bandwidth to read 4 pages of legal language closely enough to notice what else might be tucked inside it. End quote. Harold, end quote, I said, end quote. I want you to pull every document Marcus has had me sign in the last 5 years. All of it. And I want to know exactly what that power of attorney says. End quote. End quote. I already pulled it, end quote, Harold said. End quote. I pulled it the moment he called me because something in his voice told me to. Eleanor, it and Appo's not a medical power of attorney. It and Appo's broader than that. It gives him authority over, end quote. He paused again and I heard him take a breath before he said the rest, end quote, over what it calls and Appo's general financial decision-making in the event of incapacity, and Appo's with a secondary clause naming him executor of certain trust distributions, end quote. End quote. Incapacity, end quote. I repeated. End quote. I was not incapacitated, Harold. I was sitting in a hospital chair holding my husband and Appo's hand. End quote. End quote. I know that. And on paper as written, it requires 2 independent certifications of incapacity before it can actually be exercised. It and Appo's not active yet, Eleanor, it and Appo's dormant. He can and Appo's touch the trust with it. But I want you to understand something, and I want you to hear it from me, and not discover it on your own in 6 months. Somebody drafted that clause very deliberately. It didn't and Appo's come from my office. Whoever wrote it for Marcus to bring to you knew exactly what they were building, and they built it to be used later, when it would be harder for you to fight. End quote. I did not say anything for a long moment. Outside my motel window, a truck idled in the parking lot, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of my room like something searching. End quote. Harold, end quote. I said finally, end quote. Does Marcus know how much the trust actually holds? End quote. End quote. No, end quote, Harold said. End quote. As far as I and Appo's am aware, he still believes what you and Walter always let him believe, that it and Appo's worth a few million, mostly tied up in the house and some conservative investments. He has no idea Hale Distribution and Appo's minority public stake alone is worth what it and Appo's worth now, let alone what the family holds privately, end quote. Another pause. End quote. Eleanor, I think you need to consider the possibility that whoever is advising him has started doing the arithmetic anyway. End quote. I thought of Diane standing in my doorway with her arms crossed, already redecorating a house that was not yet legally hers. I thought of the flower pot on the porch, the $20, the sticky note in her handwriting. End quote. Send me copies of everything, end quote, I said. End quote. And Harold, Don and Appo's tell Marcus we spoke. Not yet. End quote. End quote, Eleanor. End quote. Harold and Appo's voice had gone very quiet, very careful. The voice he used, I realized later, only a handful of times in the years I knew him. The voice of a man about to say something he and Appo's been holding back out of respect. End quote. You built that company with your own hands. You know that, Don and Appo's to you? Whatever your son believes about who did the important work, I was in the room. I watched you do it. End quote. I did not answer that directly. I have never been good at accepting that kind of statement out loud, even when I know it to be true. End quote. Send me the documents, Harold, end quote, I said instead. End quote. And find out who drafted that clause. End quote. I moved, after 11 nights at the Sundowner, into a small rental cottage on the edge of town that belonged to a widow named Ruth and Kowalski, a woman I had known for 30 years through church without ever being close friends with her. The way you know 100 people in a small town without truly knowing any of them. Ruth and Appo's cottage was cramped and smelled faintly of cedar and had a leak in the bathroom ceiling that stained the plaster the shape of Florida. And I loved it more than I had loved any house I and Appo's ever lived in because it was mine in the small and total way that a rented room can belong to you when nobody can take the key from your hand without your consent. Word travels in a small town the way water finds the lowest point in a field, inevitably, and along paths nobody planned. Within 2 weeks, half the congregation of St. Andrew and Appo's knew that Eleanor Hale, Walter and Appo's widow, was renting a cottage from Ruth and Kowalski instead of living in her own home, and the casseroles began arriving with a frequency that suggested pity more than affection. Marcus called me 9 days after I moved into the cottage. I remember because I had just gotten off the phone with Claire, who called every Sunday without fail and who had, that particular Sunday, asked why I sounded strange, and I had not yet told her anything because I did not yet know what to tell her that Wooden and Appo's make her hate her brother, and I was not ready at that point to be the reason for that. End quote. Mom. End quote. Marcus and Appo's voice on the phone had the specific brightness of a man performing normalcy. End quote. I heard you found a place. That and Appo's great. Ruthin and Appo's cottage, right? Small but cozy, I bet. End quote. End quote. It and Appo's fine, Marcus. End quote. End quote. Good, good. End quote. A pause. I could hear in the background the particular ambient noise of a kitchen renovation. A drill, someone laughing. A radio playing something with a heavy bass line that Walter would have hated. End quote. Listen, Mom, we and Appo's having a little dinner Sunday. Nothing fancy. Just family. The boys keep asking about you. End quote. I want to tell you I said no. I did not say no. I have spent a great deal of time since then examining why I did not say no, and the truest answer I have found is this. I still loved him. Whatever he had done, whatever was being built around me with careful legal clauses and forged incapacity, he was still the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder during long car trips, still the child whose fevers I had sat up through, and some part of me, the largest part if I am honest, kept hoping that if I simply showed up calm, patient, unshaken, he would look at me across that dinner table and remember who I actually was to him. I went to dinner. The house looked different already. The gold mirror in the hallway had been joined by new light fixtures, a runner rug I didn't in Appo's recognize, a smell of fresh paint that hadn't in Appo's fully cleared. My grandsons, Tyler and Cole, hugged me at the door with the uncomplicated warmth of children who did not yet understand that anything had gone wrong, and for a moment, standing in that front hall with my grandsons and Appo's arms around my waist, I let myself pretend nothing had. Dinner was pleasant, in the surface way that dinners can be pleasant when everyone at the table has agreed, without saying so, to avoid the one subject that actually matters. Diane had made a roast. She asked about the cottage in a tone that suggested genuine curiosity, which I found in its own way more unsettling than open hostility would have been. End quote. Is it warm enough? End quote. Diane asked. End quote. Ruthin and Appo's places always run a little drafty. I and Appo's heard. End quote. End quote. It and Appo's fine. End quote. I said again. End quote. You know. End quote. Diane said, setting down her wine glass with the particular care of someone about to say something she and Appo's rehearsed. End quote. Marcus and I have been talking. We really do think long-term it might be good for you to look at some of the retirement communities out on Route 12. Cedarview, maybe. They and Appo's. We got a really lovely one there. Independent living but with support if you need it. You Wooden and Appo's have to worry about upkeep. Or drafts. End quote. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a child has said something inappropriate, and the adults are deciding whether to correct it. Tyler, who was 9, looked between his mother and me with the alert confusion of a kid who could feel something was wrong but couldn't and Appo's name it. End quote. I and Appo's. am 68 Diane. End quote. I said, keeping my voice level. End quote. Not 98. I Don and Appo's need a retirement community. I need my house back. End quote. End quote. The house is being renovated for the boys. End quote. Marcus said, too quickly. End quote. You know that. We and Appo's we been over this. End quote. End quote. We have not been over this, Marcus. You told me the house was yours. I would like to know when precisely that became true, since as of the last time I checked with Harold Weiss, the deed remains in the family trust, and I remain the trustee." End quote. I had not planned to say Harold and Appo's name. It came out of me the way true things sometimes do, unplanned at the exact moment they and Appo's most useful. I watched it land. Marcus and Appo's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Diane and Appo's face did something quick and controlled. A flicker she smoothed over almost immediately, but not quite immediately enough. End quote. "You talked to Harold?" End quote, Marcus said. End quote, "Should I not have?" End quote. End quote, "It and Appo's just." End quote. Marcus set down his fork. End quote. "Mom, Harold and Appo's getting old. He and Appo's not always as sharp as he used to be about the details. We and Appo's actually been thinking it might make sense to bring in someone newer to help manage the trust paperwork going forward. Somebody who specializes in situations like this." End quote. End quote. "Situations like what, Marcus?" End quote. "He didn't and Appo's answer that. Diane answered for him." End quote. "Eleanor," end quote, she said, and her voice had shifted now, gentle in the specific practiced way of someone delivering bad news wrapped in soft language. End quote. "We love you. We do. But Marcus and I have both noticed, and it and Appo's nothing to be ashamed of. It happens to everyone eventually. We and Appo's noticed you and Appo's seemed a little confused lately, forgetting things, getting details of the trust mixed up. It and Appo's part of why we think a place like Cedarview might really help. Somewhere with support." End quote. I sat very still. Somewhere in my chest, something that had been quietly, patiently open. A door I had been holding ajar for my son for months, maybe longer, closed without a sound, the way heavy doors sometimes close, more felt than heard. End quote. "I have not forgotten anything, Diane." End quote, I said. End quote. "I remember every detail of every document I have ever signed. I remember exactly how the trust is structured because I structured half of it myself alongside my husband. Over 40 years of building something, the two of us started with 11,000 borrowed dollars and a hand-painted sign on a rented warehouse door. I have not once, in 68 years, forgotten what is mine." End quote. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Cole, who was 6, asked if there was more mashed potatoes, and the ordinary sound of that small voice was, for a moment, the only thing in the room that felt uncomplicated. I left before dessert. I hugged my grandsons at the door. I did not hug Marcus. Driving back to Ruth and Appo's cottage in the dark, I thought about the word Diane had used. Confused. I thought about how carefully she and Appo's chosen it, how gently she and Appo's delivered it, how it was exactly the kind of word that said enough times in enough rooms to enough people could start to look on paper like the beginning of a case. I called Harold from the cottage that night, later than I usually called him, late enough that I heard the particular gravel of sleep in his voice when he answered. End quote. "Harold," end quote, I said. End quote. "I think they and Appo's rebuilding a case that I and Appo's am losing my mind." End quote. There was a silence on the line, the kind of silence that meant he was now fully, immediately awake. End quote. "Eleanor," end quote, he said. End quote. "Tell me everything that was said at that dinner. Word for word if you can." End quote. I told him. All of it. The retirement community. The word confused. The offer to bring in someone new to manage the trust paperwork. When I finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. And an independent one, not your regular physician, not anyone Marcus or Diane has ever heard of. A full cognitive evaluation. Today if we can get you in. Tomorrow at the latest. End quote. End quote. "Harold, I and Appo's am not confused. You know I and Appo's am not confused." End quote. End quote. "I know that, Eleanor. I have known you for 40 years and I would trust your mind against anyone in Appo's. I and Appo's they ever met. But I need it on paper, dated, independent and signed before anyone else can put a different version of that paper in front of a judge. Do you understand what I and Appo's am telling you?" End quote. I understood. I sat in Ruth and Appo's small cottage in a leaking ceiling room shaped like the state of Florida, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its simplicity, that my son was preparing to have me declared incompetent, and that the only way to stop him was to move faster and more quietly than he expected a 68-year-old widow in a rented cottage to be capable of moving. End quote. Harold, end quote, I said. End quote. I think it and Oppos. Time you told me everything you know about who and Oppos. Been advising him. End quote. Harold exhaled slowly. End quote. There and Oppos. A name that and Oppos. Come up, end quote, he said. End quote. I wasn't and Oppos. Going to bring it to you until I was sure. But since you and Oppos re-asking, do you remember a young man named Preston Duke? Worked at Hale Distribution and Oppos' finance office for about 18 months 6 years ago, before he left rather suddenly? End quote. I did remember him. Barely. A sharp, ambitious young man Marcus had brought in, who Walter had disliked instantly and without ever fully explaining why, and who had left the company under circumstances nobody had ever explained to me clearly. End quote. What about him? End quote. End quote. He and Oppos' wealth strategy consultant now, Eleanor. Very expensive. Very discreet. And 3 weeks ago, he filed paperwork with the county registering a new limited liability company, Alliance Advisory Partners. Marcus is listed as a silent partner. End quote. I looked out Ruth and Oppos' small window at the dark street at a single porch light glowing 2 houses down, and I felt something inside me settle, not into despair, but into a kind of cold, clean resolve I had not felt since the early years of building Hale Distribution, back when Walter and I had nothing but a warehouse and a debt in each other and Oppos' stubborn belief that we would find a way through. End quote. Harold, end quote, I said. End quote. Get me that appointment tomorrow. And then I want you to start pulling every document that and Oppos' been filed everywhere with anyone in Oppos' name on it going back 6 years. All of it. I want to know exactly what my son has been building, before he finds out I and Oppos' already started dismantling it. End quote. Dr. Priya Anand had a small, unhurried practice 2 counties over, recommended by Harold precisely because she had no connection to anyone in our town, no history with Marcus, no reason to see me as anything other than exactly what I was. She spent nearly 3 hours with me, memory tests, reasoning exercises, a long conversation about my finances, my medications, my daily routine, my understanding of the documents Marcus had asked me to sign. End quote, Mrs. Hale, end quote. She said at the end of it, setting down her pen, end quote. I want to be direct with you because I suspect directness is what you and Oppos' prefer. There is no evidence here of any cognitive impairment. None. Your recall, your reasoning, your executive function, all of it is well within normal range for a woman of any age, let alone concerning at 68. I and Oppos' have the full written evaluation to you and to your attorney within the week. End quote. End quote. Thank you, end quote, I said. I did not tell her why I needed it so urgently. She did not ask. I suspect from something careful in her expression, that she had seen this particular request before from other women for similar reasons, and had learned not to make them explain themselves. Called Claire that night. I had put it off for 3 weeks, telling myself I was protecting her, when the truth which I made myself say out loud alone in Ruth and Oppos' cottage was that I had been protecting Marcus, protecting the version of him I still wanted to believe in, by keeping his sister from seeing the evidence against him. End quote, Mom, end quote. Claire and Oppos' voice when she picked up had the particular alertness of someone who and Oppos' been waiting for a call she didn't and Oppos' know was coming. End quote, it and Oppos' Wednesday. You never call on Wednesdays. End quote. End quote. Claire, end quote, I said. End quote, I need to tell you some things and I need you to let me finish before you say anything because if you interrupt me I don't and Oppos' think I and Oppos' I'll get through it. End quote. She let me finish. It took 40 minutes. The locks, the $20, the power of attorney signed at Walter and Oppos' bedside, the dinner, the word confused Preston Duke, Alliance Advisory Partners, the doctor and Oppos' appointment that morning. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. End quote. Claire? End quote. End quote. I and Oppos' am here. End quote. Her voice had gone very quiet, very controlled in a way that reminded me painfully of myself. End quote. Mom, I need you to know something and I don't and Oppos' know how to say it gently so I and Oppos' I'm just going to say it. I tried to warn you about Diane 4 years ago. At Tyler and Appo's christening. Do you remember? I told you I didn't end Appo's. Trust the way she talked about Dad and Appo's business, the question she kept asking me about how it was structured. And you told me I was being unkind to your daughter-in-law and we didn't end Appo's talk for 2 months. End quote. I remembered exactly how certain I had been that Claire was simply struggling with old sibling rivalry, dressed up as concern. I had been wrong about that, in a way that cost us both 2 months we would never get back, and I said so. End quote. I and Appo's. I'm sorry, Claire. End quote. End quote. I know. End quote. A breath shaky on the other end of the line. End quote. I and Appo's. I'm not saying it to punish you, Mom. I and Appo's. I'm saying it because I need you to actually believe me this time about what I and Appo's am about to tell you instead of deciding I and Appo's am exaggerating because I and Appo's am still angry at Marcus for things that happened 20 years ago. End quote. End quote. I believe you, end quote, I said. End quote. Tell me. End quote. End quote. Diane called me 6 weeks ago. Before any of this happened with the house. End quote. Claire and Appo's voice tightened. End quote. She wanted to know if I and Appo's signed something. A statement, she called it, saying I and Appo's witnessed you having memory problems over the last few years. She said it was just precautionary, in case you ever needed extra support and couldn't and Appo's manage your own affairs, end quote. The cold, clean resolve I and Appo's felt the night before with Harold hardened into something with an edge. End quote. What did you tell her? End quote. End quote. I told her to lose my number, end quote, Claire said. End quote. And then I called a friend of Robert and Appo's who does elder law just to ask hypothetically what that kind of document could be used for. He told me, Mom, they were in an Appo's asking me for a favor. They were building a file. End quote. I sat with that for a long moment in Ruth and Appo's cottage, looking at the water stain shaped like Florida on the ceiling. End quote. Claire, end quote, I said finally, end quote. I need to tell you one more thing, and I need you to hear it the way I and Appo's am about to say it, not the way you and Appo's expecting, end quote. End quote. Okay. End quote. End quote. Your father and I never told you and Marcus the full truth about Hale distribution. Not the real numbers. We told you a version, comfortable but modest, because your father believed money changed people before they and Appo's earned the character to hold it, and I agreed with him. I still agree with him mostly. But I think the time for that particular kindness has passed, because I believe your brother is trying to have me declared incompetent so that he can gain control of a fortune he does not know the true size of. And I am done protecting him from a truth that might have made him behave differently if he and Appo's known it sooner, end quote. Claire was quiet for a long moment. End quote. How big, Mom? End quote. I told her. Not every figure. Harold and I had not yet finished the full accounting ourselves, but enough. The controlling stake in Hale Distribution Group, now one of the largest privately held logistics operations in 4 states. The family trust, structured across 4 decades, that held not just the company shares but a diversified portfolio Walter and I had built quietly alongside it. Real estate, a controlling interest in 2 regional pharmaceutical distribution subsidiaries, a foundation we and Appo's endowed but never publicized. When I finished, Claire didn't and Appo's say anything for so long I thought the line had dropped again. End quote, Mom, end quote, she said finally very quietly, end quote. Marcus thinks, end quote, this is going to take a while. End quote. Preston Duke, it turned out, had not simply advised Marcus. He had architected an entire structure, patient and layered, built over the better part of 2 years, long before Walter and Appo's health had even begun to fail. Care Alliance Advisory Partners existed on paper as a family care consulting firm, the kind of entity that could plausibly bill for services like, end quote, elder support coordination, end quote, and, end quote, estate transition planning, end quote, without raising immediate suspicion. Its only 2 clients, as far as Harold and Appo's investigator could determine, were Marcus and Diane themselves. End quote. They and Appo's been paying themselves, end quote, Harold said, spreading documents across Ruth and Appo's small kitchen table, end quote, Out of a joint account Marcus opened using a limited financial power of attorney, the medical one, the one you signed at the hospital, for what they and Oppos, recalling and Oppos, anticipated caregiving expenses and Oppos, Eleanor, they started drawing against that account 4 months before Walter died, end quote. I looked at the numbers. Modest at first, a few $100s here, a few thousand there, the kind of amounts that could be argued away as reasonable if anyone ever asked. But the trend line climbed, month over month, in the unmistakable shape of a plan gaining confidence. End quote. There and Oppos, S. More, end quote, Harold said, and his voice had the particular gentleness he used only when he was about to say something that would hurt. End quote. The retirement community Diane mentioned at dinner. Cedarview. I had my investigator look into ownership. It and Oppos. S. held by a real estate holding company registered in Delaware. Eleanor, the holding company, and Oppos. S. registered agent is Preston Duke. End quote. I sat back in my chair. End quote. They were going to profit twice, end quote. I said slowly, understanding arriving the way it sometimes does, all at once in a single cold wave. End quote. Once from taking control of the trust. And again from placing me somewhere they already owned a stake in. End quote. End quote. That and Oppos. S. my read as well, end quote, Harold said. End quote. And there and Oppos. S. one more thing, and I want you to brace yourself for it because it and Oppos. S. the piece that changes what kind of case this is. End quote. He slid a single document across the table. A petition, drafted but not yet filed, for emergency limited guardianship, citing my documented pattern of memory impairment and financial confusion, requesting immediate authority over my medical decisions and my financial affairs, including, the language was careful, almost elegant in its cruelty, any trust instruments in which the petitioner and Oppos' mother holds a beneficial or controlling interest. Attached to the draft petition was a letter, purportedly from a neurologist, diagnosing me with a progressive cognitive decline. I did not recognize the doctor and Oppos' name. I had never in my life met the man whose signature appeared at the bottom of that letter. End quote, Harold, end quote, I said, and I heard my own voice go very quiet, very steady, in the way it did when I was angrier than I had words for yet. End quote. Find out who this doctor is. End quote. End quote. Already did, end quote, Harold said. End quote. His license was suspended 8 years ago in another state, for exactly this, selling incapacity letters to families in contested inheritance disputes. He and Oppos' been operating quietly since then under a consulting arrangement that keeps him just far enough removed from direct patient care that no one and Oppos' caught him. Eleanor, he and Oppos' done this before. Your son found, or was pointed toward, someone who specializes in exactly this crime, end quote. I picked up the forged letter and read it twice slowly, memorizing the shape of the lie the way I used to memorize columns of figures at our kitchen table 40 years earlier. Back when the only thing at stake was whether we could make payroll. End quote. Has this been filed yet? End quote. End quote. Not yet. My source tells me they and Oppos. Waiting for one more piece, a second corroborating letter, probably from someone closer to home, someone who in Oppos' actually examined you. I suspect that in Oppos' the pressure behind the retirement community push. If they can get you into Cedarview voluntarily, even briefly, they gain a facility willing to write exactly the kind of letter they need. End quote. I thought of Diane and Oppos' gentle voice at dinner. We really do think it might be good for you. I thought of how close I had come in a weak moment 3 weeks earlier to agreeing to, end quote, just visit, end quote, Cedarview simply to keep the peace, simply because some tired, grieving part of me still wanted more than anything, for my son to look at me with love instead of calculation. End quote, Harold, end quote, I said. End quote. I want Dr. Anand and Oppos' evaluation filed with the court sealed before they can file anything else. I want it on record, independently, dated, before their forged letter ever sees daylight. And I want you to start building a case, quietly, patiently, documenting every dollar that and Oppos' moved through that finance office and that holding company, going back as far as the trail goes. End quote. End quote. That could take months, Eleanor. End quote. End quote. Then it takes months, end quote, I said. End quote. I am 68 years old, Harold, not dying. I can be patient. What I want is for my son to believe for as long as possible that he is winning. I want him to keep making decisions from a position of confidence, because a confident man makes mistakes a frightened one never would. And when he has made enough of them, I want to be standing in a room he cannot walk out of, with proof he cannot argue away." End quote. Harold looked at me for a long moment across Ruth and Appo's small kitchen table, and something in his expression, not pity, not concern, something closer to recognition, told me he was seeing, perhaps for the first time in 40 years of knowing me, the woman who had actually built half of Hale Distribution Group with her own hands, rather than the quiet widow everyone else had decided I must be. End quote. "Eleanor Hale," end quote, he said, end quote, "I don't and Appo's. T think your son has any idea who he and Appo's dealing with?" End quote. End quote. "No," end quote, I said. End quote. "He doesn't and Appo's T. And I intend to keep it that way for as long as it and Appo's useful." End quote. I had not spoken to my nephew Danny in almost 6 years, not out of any particular falling out, but out of the ordinary drift that happens in families when nobody makes the effort to close the distance, a distance that had widened in Danny and Appo's case after his mother, my younger sister Patricia, passed away, and there was no longer a reason for our two branches of the family to gather at holidays. Danny called me, out of nowhere, on a Thursday evening in April, 8 weeks after I and Appo's moved into Ruth and Appo's cottage. End quote. "Aunt Eleanor," end quote, he said, and I could hear, underneath the familiar warmth of his voice, something careful, something weighing whether to say what he and Appo's called to say. End quote. "I heard about the house. I and Appo's am sorry. I should have called sooner." End quote. End quote. "How did you hear, Danny?" End quote. End quote. "That and Appo's actually why I and Appo's am calling." End quote. A pause. End quote. "I work in the finance office at Hale Distribution, Aunt Eleanor. Have for about 3 years now. Entry-level stuff mostly. I never told you because I didn't and Appo's want it to look like I was trying to trade on the family name." End quote. I hadn't and Appo's known. Walter and I had, in our later years, stepped back enough from day-to-day operations that I no longer recognized every name on the org chart, and Danny, it seemed, had wanted it that way. End quote. "I didn't and Appo's know," end quote, I said. End quote. "What is it you wanted to tell me?" End quote. End quote. "There and Appo's a project," end quote, Danny said, his voice dropping lower, as though the walls of my rented cottage might somehow carry his words back to a finance office 40 minutes away. End quote. "Confidential, run directly out of Marcus and Appo's office, coded under a project name Continuity Transition. I only know about it because I was pulled in 2 weeks ago to help reconcile some historical trust distribution records. Aunt Eleanor, they and Appo's rebuilding a full financial model of every asset the family trust holds. Valuations, projected liquidation timelines, tax structuring for a large-scale transfer of control. It and Appo's the kind of model you build when you and Appo's preparing to take over something enormous, not when you and Appo's helping an elderly relative manage her checkbook." End quote. End quote. "Does Marcus know you and Appo's seen this?" End quote. End quote. "No. I wasn't in Appo's supposed to see the full model. I was only supposed to reconcile one historical data set. But the file wasn't in Appo's permission correctly, and once I saw the scope of it I couldn't and Appo's unsee it." End quote. A long breath. End quote. "Aunt Eleanor, there and Appo's a name on the model and Appo's approval chain I didn't and Appo's recognize. A consultant." End quote. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer, because what I and Appo's am about to ask could cost you your job, and possibly more than that if it goes wrong." End quote. End quote. "Ask me," end quote, Danny said without hesitation, and I heard, in that immediate willingness, an echo of his mother, my sister, who had never once in her life let fear slow her down when someone she loved needed her. End quote. "Will you help me?" Quietly. "Documenting what you see without taking anything you and Appo's not authorized to access, without breaking any law yourself, but watching and telling me, and if it comes to it, willing to say what you and Appo's told me tonight in a room with a judge in it." End quote. There was a pause on the line, not of hesitation, I understood after a moment, but of a young man squaring something with himself. End quote. Aunt Eleanor, end quote. Danny said, end quote, my mom used to tell me a story about you. About how, back when you and Uncle Walter were starting out, some supplier tried to shortchange you on a shipment, and you drove out to his warehouse alone at 6 in the morning with the invoice and a calculator, and you didn't and oppose, leave until he and oppose, recounted every case in front of you and paid what he actually owed. She said it was the most Eleanor thing she and oppose, ever seen. Not loud, not angry, just completely unwilling to accept a number that was wrong. End quote. End quote. I remember that morning, end quote. I said, and found to my own surprise that I was smiling faintly for the first time in weeks. End quote. I and oppose. I'll help you, end quote, Danny said. End quote. Somebody in oppose, trying to shortchange you again. I and oppose. Rather be the guy holding the calculator this time than the guy who found out later and did nothing. End quote. The second incapacity letter arrived in Marcus and Oppo's file exactly as Harold and Oppo's source had predicted. A corroborating evaluation, this one from a doctor with an active license, Dr. Warren Castellano, whose surname I recognized immediately as Diane and Oppo's own. Her uncle, it turned out, a general practitioner 2 towns over who had, according to public records, Harold and Oppo's investigator pulled seen me exactly once for a sinus infection 4 years earlier and never again. His letter, dated the week after Marcus and Oppo's dinner table conversation about Cedarview, described a, end quote, notable decline in short-term memory and judgment consistent with early-stage dementia, end quote, and recommended, end quote, immediate implementation of supportive guardianship measures to protect the patient from financial exploitation risk, end quote. End quote. Financial exploitation risk, end quote. Harold read aloud in Ruth and Oppo's kitchen, his voice flat with a controlled fury I had rarely heard from him in 40 years of friendship. End quote. Eleanor, they and Oppo's, reframing you as the vulnerable party. If this letter gets in front of a judge before Dr. Anand and Oppo's evaluation is properly on record, a judge could reasonably read this and believe your son is trying to protect you from someone else entirely, end quote. End quote. Then we make sure it doesn't, and Oppo's get there first, end quote, I said. We moved quickly after that. Dr. Anand and Oppo's full evaluation, thorough and unambiguous, was filed under seal with the county court the following week, alongside a formal notice, drafted by Harold, disputing any future incapacity claim and putting on record that I had, as of that date, been independently and comprehensively assessed as fully competent. It was not a lawsuit. It was, Harold explained, something quieter and in some ways more powerful, a marker in the sand, dated and notarized, that would make it far harder for Marcus and Oppo's petition whenever it was finally filed, to claim any element of surprise or urgency. Danny continued sending what he could, carefully, never taking a document he wasn't and Oppo's authorized to see, but noting patterns, dates, meetings he wasn't and Oppo's invited to but overheard the edges of. 2 weeks after his first call, he told me something that made the whole shape of the plan sharpen into something I finally understood I could use. End quote. There and Oppo's a gala, end quote, Danny said. End quote. Hale distribution and Oppo's 40th anniversary. It and Oppo's being planned as a huge event, the whole leadership team, the board, major shareholders, a lot of the old guard who worked with you and Uncle Walter from the early days. Marcus is chairing the planning committee. Aunt Eleanor, the date lines up almost exactly with the target window in that financial model I saw. I think he and Oppo's planning to use the gala as the moment he formally steps into a public leadership role, introduce himself as the face of the company and Oppo's next 40 years in front of everyone who matters, right around the same time the guardianship filing would be finalized. End quote. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, feeling something settle inside me that I recognized, distantly, as the same instinct that had once told me exactly which supplier route to cut in 1974, exactly which risk was worth taking and which would sink us. End quote. Danny, end quote, I said, end quote, when is this gala? End quote. End quote, 11 weeks. Same window as the target date in the model. End quote. End quote. And who and Oppo's organizing the guest list? End quote. End quote. Marcus and Oppo's office. Why? End quote. I looked out Ruth and Oppo's small window at the ordinary evening light falling across an ordinary street, and felt the outline of a plan begin to take shape, not a plan built from anger, though there was anger enough underneath it to power a great deal, but a plan built the way I had always built things, patiently, with numbers and documents and the quiet certainty that comes from having done the arithmetic correctly. End quote, because I want to make sure, end quote, I said, end quote, that I and Oppos am on it. End quote. Marcus did not know in the weeks that followed that he was being watched. He believed, as far as anyone could tell, that he was winning, and a man who believes he is winning, I had learned across 4 decades of business, tends to stop being careful. The pressure on me increased in small, deniable ways. Diane began stopping by Ruth and Oppos' cottage unannounced, always with some gentle pretext. A casserole, a magazine article about, end quote, senior wellness, end quote. She thought I and Oppos find interesting, a brochure for Cedarview left, seemingly by accident, on my kitchen table after she and Oppos used my bathroom. Each visit ended, in one form or another, with a version of the same suggestion, that I consider a short trial stay somewhere with more support. End quote. Just for a few weeks, Eleanor, end quote. She said on one visit, her voice warm and reasonable in exactly the register that made refusal sound unreasonable in return. End quote. Just to see how you like it. No commitment. End quote. End quote. I like my own home, end quote, I said. End quote. The one Marcus locked me out of. End quote. Diane and Oppos' smile flickered just slightly at the reminder. End quote. That was about the renovation, Eleanor. You know that. End quote. End quote. Do I? End quote. I did not raise my voice. I never raised my voice in any of those visits, no matter how many times Diane circled back to the same gentle, relentless suggestion, because I understood, with a clarity that steadied me more than anger ever could have, that every visit, every phone call, every brochure left conveniently on my table, was itself becoming evidence, not of my decline but of theirs. Marcus called less often than Diane visited, but when he did call, the conversations had a new undertone, something almost pleading beneath the surface confidence. End quote. Mom, I really think you and Oppos feel better if you just talk to someone, end quote, he said during one call in early May. End quote. A specialist. Just to rule things out. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos already spoken to a specialist, Marcus. End quote. Pause, careful, calculating. End quote. Who? End quote. End quote. Dr. Priya Anand, an independent cognitive specialist, recommended by Harold Weiss, with no connection to this family whatsoever. She spent 3 hours with me. She found nothing. It and Oppos' on file with the county court, dated, sealed, and notarized. I and Oppos be happy to give you the case number if you and Oppos like to check it yourself. End quote. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I could hear, faintly, Diane and Oppos' voice in the background asking Marcus what was wrong. End quote. You went to a doctor, end quote. Marcus said finally, his voice flat. End quote. Without telling me. End quote. End quote. I am 68 years old, Marcus. I do not require your permission to visit a doctor. I would think if your concern for my well-being were genuine, you and Oppos be relieved to hear I and Oppos been thoroughly evaluated and found entirely competent, end quote. End quote. That and Oppos not, end quote. He stopped himself. Started again, his voice tightening. End quote. Mom, I Don and Oppos know what Harold and Oppos been telling you, but he and Oppos not thinking about this clearly. He and Oppos known you too long. He can and Oppos be objective anymore. We should really bring in someone who can look at this without history clouding things. End quote. I know about Care Alliance Advisory Partners. I know about the account you opened with the medical power of attorney I signed at your father and Oppos' bedside, and I know how much has moved through it since, and for what purposes it was not, in fact, used. I know about Cedarview, and who holds the registered ownership of the holding company behind it. And I know about the letter your wife and Oppos' uncle wrote describing a decline in a patient he has seen exactly once 4 years ago, for a sinus infection, end quote. I heard Marcus and Oppos' breathing change on the other end of the line, quicker, shallower, the sound of a man whose careful architecture had just begun audibly to crack. End quote. Mom, whatever you think you know, end quote. End quote. I know exactly what I know, Marcus, because I have spent 40 years learning to read a set of books more carefully than the person who wrote them intended. I taught myself that skill before you were born. Did you think I would forget how to use it simply because I am grieving your father?" End quote. He did not answer that. I did not expect him to. End quote. "I would like you to know something else," end quote, I said before he could recover enough to respond. End quote. "I am not currently planning to take any legal action against you. I am simply telling you what I know because I think you should have the chance to stop on your own before this goes further than either of us can undo. Your father built that company believing that people, given the chance, will generally choose to become who they claim they want to be. I would like to still believe that about you." End quote. End quote, Mom, end quote. End quote, "Goodbye, Marcus." End quote. I hung up before he could say anything more. My hands were shaking slightly when I set the phone down on Ruth and Appo's small kitchen table. Not from fear, I realized, examining the feeling carefully the way I examined everything, but from the particular exhaustion of having, for the first time in 3 months, told my son something entirely uncompromisingly true, and watched him receive it with nothing that resembled remorse. 2 days later, Harold called with news that told me exactly how Marcus had chosen to respond. End quote. "They and Appo's filed it, Eleanor," end quote, Harold said. End quote. "The emergency guardianship petition. This afternoon. They didn't and Appo's wait for the board meeting window. They and Appo's planned. I think your call scared him into moving early." End quote. End quote. "What does it ask for?" End quote. End quote. "Immediate emergency authority over your medical decisions, and this is the part one wants you prepared for. Immediate emergency authority over and Appo's any and all trust instruments in which the respondent holds a beneficial interest and Appo's pending a full competency hearing. If a judge grants the emergency portion even provisionally, Marcus could gain temporary signing authority over the trust within days, Eleanor. Before the full hearing even happens." End quote. I sat very still in Ruth and Appo's cottage and felt, for the first time since the locks changed on my own front door, something close to real fear, not for myself, but for the 40 years of careful work Walter and I had built, now sitting exposed, for a matter of days, to a son who had shown me unmistakably exactly what he was willing to do with it. End quote. "When is the emergency hearing?" End quote. End quote. "Friday. 2 days from now." End quote. End quote. "Then we go to Friday," end quote, I said, end quote, prepared to win it in a single afternoon, end quote. I did not sleep the night before the emergency hearing, not out of fear, but out of the particular restless focus I remembered from the early years of Hale distribution, the nights before a major shipment or a bank meeting, when the only thing to do with a mind that would not quiet down was to use it. Harold and I worked until nearly 2 in the morning in Ruth and Appo's small kitchen, spreading documents across a table that had never, in Ruth and Appo's ownership of that cottage, held so much paper at once. Dr. Anand and Appo's sealed evaluation. The financial records Danny had helped trace, showing the flow of funds through Care Alliance advisory partners, and into accounts Marcus and Diane controlled directly. The registration documents for the Cedarview Holding Company, tracing back to Preston Duke. And most damning of all, a forensic analysis Harold and Appo's investigator had commissioned of the neurologist and Appo's letter, the fabricated one from the doctor whose license had been suspended 8 years earlier, which revealed, through metadata buried in the document itself, that the letter had been drafted using a template found, word for word except for the patient and Appo's name. In 2 other guardianship cases the same doctor had been paid to support in a different state. End quote. He and Appo's done this before, end quote, Harold said, sliding the forensic report across the table. End quote. At least twice that we can prove so far. This ISN and Appo's a doctor with questionable judgment, Eleanor. This is a man who sells false diagnoses to families who want to seize control of a relative and Appo's assets. And your son hired him, end quote. I looked at the 2 letters side by side, the language nearly identical, only the names changed, and felt something in me go very quiet and very certain. End quote, Harold, end quote, I said, end quote, I want Danny in the courtroom Friday. Not to testify, not yet, not until we and Appo's, resure it and Appo's, the right moment, but I want him there. I want Marcus to see that his own cousin has been watching. End quote. End quote. And Claire? End quote. I had already asked her. She had already said yes without hesitation and told me she was bringing Robert, and that she had, in the 3 weeks since our long phone call, quietly begun reaching out to a handful of the old guard executives who had worked with Walter and me from the earliest years of the company, people who remembered better than Marcus ever had, exactly whose hands had built Hale Distribution Group. End quote. She and Oppos. I'll be there, end quote, I said. We finished at 2 in the morning. Harold gathered the documents into 3 neat, labeled folders and stood at Ruth and Oppos' front door for a long moment before leaving, looking at me with an expression I had seen on his face only rarely across 4 decades. Not the careful, professional concern of an attorney managing a difficult case, but something closer to pride. End quote. Eleanor, end quote. He said, end quote. Whatever happens Friday, I want you to know something. Walter used to tell me more than once over the years that the company would have failed in its first 2 years without you. He said it plainly more than once, though never in front of Marcus, which I always thought was a mistake on his part, however well-intentioned. I think you should hear it from someone before Friday. You didn't, and Oppos. T just helped build Hale Distribution, Eleanor. You are, in every way that matters, the reason it still exists, end quote. I did not trust myself to answer that without my voice breaking, so I simply thanked him and let him go, and stood for a long time at Ruth and Oppos' small window looking out at the dark street, thinking not about Friday, but about a kitchen table 40 years earlier, lit by a single lamp, and a young woman doing arithmetic long past midnight because somebody had to make sure the dream didn't end Oppos' collapse before it had a chance to become real. The county courthouse on Friday morning was not the grand marble building people imagine from television. A squat brick structure from the 1960s, fluorescent lit, smelling faintly of floor wax, with a probate courtroom no larger than a church fellowship hall. I had expected walking in to feel small in it. Instead, sitting beside Harold at the respondent and Oppos' table with Claire and Robert directly behind me and Danny 2 rows back, I felt something closer to the particular calm I used to feel standing in the warehouse at 4 in the morning, watching the first trucks load. The calm of a woman standing exactly where the work of 40 years had prepared her to stand. Marcus arrived with Diane and 2 attorneys, dressed in a suit that looked, I noted with a distant, almost clinical detachment, considerably more expensive than anything he and Oppos' worn to his own father and Oppos' funeral. He did not look at me as he sat down. Diane did, once, a quick assessing glance that I met without flinching, and watched her look away first. Judge Patricia Ellery entered without ceremony and got immediately to business. Marcus and Oppos' attorney rose first, presenting the emergency petition with the practiced fluency of a man who had done this exact thing many times before, describing a mother in decline, a son forced by love and duty to seek protection for her, financial affairs at risk of exploitation by unnamed parties, a family torn apart by an elderly woman and Oppos' confusion and an estranged daughter and Oppos' opportunism. He introduced the letter from the suspended licensed neurologist first. Then the corroborating letter from Diane and Oppos' uncle. He gestured once toward me, with the careful compassion of a man delivering difficult truths. End quote, Your Honor, end quote. He said, end quote. Mrs. Hale is a woman of modest means, a widow living alone in rented accommodations, showing clear and documented signs of cognitive decline. My client seeks only the authority necessary to protect his mother from the very real risk of financial exploitation that vulnerable elderly individuals face every day, end quote. I watched Judge Ellery and Oppos' face as he spoke. She was listening carefully, taking notes, giving nothing away, the expression, I thought, of a woman who had heard exactly this kind of argument many times before and had learned not to render judgment until she and Oppos' heard the rest of the story. Harold rose when Marcus and Oppos' attorney finished. End quote, Your Honor, end quote. He said, end quote, I and Oppos' like to begin by entering into evidence a comprehensive independent cognitive evaluation, conducted by Dr. Priya Anand, filed under seal with this court 6 weeks ago, a full 3 weeks before the petitioner filed today and Oppos' emergency motion. Dr. Anand found no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. I and Oppos' also like to enter a forensic analysis of the neurologist and Oppos' letter submitted by the petitioner, which reveals that the letter was drafted using a template previously used to support fraudulent incapacity claims in 2 other jurisdictions, by a physician whose medical license has been suspended for 8 years for precisely this conduct. End quote. The courtroom, small as it was, went very still. Marcus and Oppos' attorney rose to object. Judge Ellery overruled him and told Harold to continue. End quote. I and Oppos' also like the court to understand the actual scope of what is at stake in this petition. End quote. Harold said, and I watched Marcus and Oppos' face for the first time that morning show something other than practiced composure. End quote. The petitioner describes his mother as a woman of modest means. Your Honor, Eleanor Hale is the co-founder and majority trustee of the family trust controlling Hale Distribution Group, one of the largest privately held logistics operations in this region, alongside significant additional holdings in real estate and pharmaceutical distribution. The petitioner and Oppos' emergency motion, if granted, would transfer provisional signing authority over that entire trust to a man who has, we can demonstrate, already been diverting trust-adjacent funds through a shell consulting entity for the better part of 2 years, in anticipation of exactly this outcome. End quote. End quote. Your Honor, this is, end quote. Marcus and Oppos' attorney was on his feet again, and this time I could hear, underneath his practiced composure, the particular strain of a man realizing his case was coming apart faster than he and Oppos' prepared for. End quote. Sit down, counsel. End quote. Judge Ellery said, not unkindly, but with an authority that ended the interruption instantly. End quote. I and Oppos' like to see the documentation Mr. Weiss is referencing. End quote. Harold submitted the folders. The judge read for a long time. Long enough that the small courtroom filled with a silence so complete I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I did not look at Marcus during that silence. I looked instead at my hands folded in my lap and thought of Walter, and of a hand-lettered sign nailed to a rented warehouse door, and of everything that sign had, over 4 decades, quietly become. When Judge Ellery finally looked up, her expression had changed entirely. End quote, Mr. Hale. End quote. She said, addressing Marcus directly for the first time. End quote. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that your answer matters a great deal to how I proceed today. Were you aware, at the time you filed this petition, of the actual value and structure of the family trust you sought emergency authority over? End quote. Marcus did not answer immediately. I watched him glance once at his attorney and saw the attorney and Oppos' face give him nothing useful. End quote. End quote. Marcus started then stopped. End quote. Your Honor, my mother and Oppos' finances have always been managed somewhat privately. I wasn't and Oppos' fully aware of every detail. End quote. End quote. So you sought emergency guardianship over assets whose scope you did not fully understand. End quote. Judge Ellery said. End quote. Based on medical documentation that has now been shown, through independent forensic analysis, to be fraudulent, filed against a woman who was independently evaluated as fully competent 3 weeks before your petition. Is that an accurate summary, Mr. Hale? End quote. The silence that followed was, I thought, the loudest silence I had ever sat inside. End quote. Your Honor. End quote. Marcus said finally, his voice smaller than I had heard it since he was a boy. End quote. I was trying to protect my mother. End quote. End quote. From what, Mr. Hale? End quote. Judge Ellery and Oppos' voice had gone very quiet, very precise. End quote. Based on what I have in front of me, it appears the person your mother most needed protection from may have been sitting at this table. End quote. Judge Ellery denied the emergency petition in its entirety. She did not stop there. Citing the forensic evidence of the fraudulent medical letter and the financial documentation Harold had presented, she referred the matter directly to the county and Oppos' Adult Protective Services Division and separately, to the District Attorney and Oppos' Office for review of possible elder financial exploitation and fraud. She ordered an immediate freeze on the account associated with Care Alliance Advisory Partners, pending a full investigation, and scheduled a comprehensive hearing on the trust itself for 8 weeks out, not to determine my competency, which she stated plainly on the record was no longer in question, but to determine what remedies I might be entitled to pursue against my son. Marcus did not look at me as the hearing ended. Diane and Oppos' face when I glanced at her once on my way out of the courtroom, had gone the pale, stunned color of someone watching a structure she had spent years quietly reinforcing collapse in the space of 40 minutes. I did not feel triumphant, walking out of that courthouse into the gray daylight of a Friday afternoon. I felt mostly tired in the particular way that comes after holding something taut for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Claire took my arm on the courthouse steps. Danny stood a little apart, watching his cousin walk to a car alone, his father having driven separately, and I saw in Danny and Appo's face something that looked almost like grief and understood that he too had hoped in some small corner of himself that this would end differently. End quote. What happens now? End quote. Claire asked as we walked to Harold and Appo's car. End quote. Now, end quote, I said, end quote, we wait. And we let the district attorney and Appo's office do the part of this that ISN and Appo's mind to do. And in 8 weeks we go to the gala. End quote. Claire looked at me startled. End quote. You and Appo's still going to the anniversary gala? Mom, after everything, end quote. End quote. Especially after everything, end quote, I said. End quote. Your father built that company for 40 years. I built it beside him for every single one of those years, in ways almost nobody in that ballroom will remember, because I chose deliberately for almost all of them not to be remembered. I am done choosing that. I am going to that gala, Claire, and I am going to stand in front of every person who has ever quietly assumed I was simply Walter and Appo's widow, and I am going to let them see finally exactly who built that company alongside him. End quote. Harold, driving, caught my eye in the rearview mirror. End quote. Are you sure about the timing, Eleanor? The DA and Appo's investigation will still be pending. It could get complicated doing this in public before it and Appo's resolved. End quote. End quote. I and Appo's am sure, end quote, I said. End quote. I have spent 3 months being patient, Harold, letting my son believe he was winning, letting a false letter sit in a file until it could be dismantled properly instead of simply denied. I am not interested in complicated any longer. I am interested in the truth spoken once clearly, in a room large enough that nobody in it can pretend afterward they didn't and Appo's hear it, end quote. The 8 weeks that followed moved with a strange, suspended quality, the particular stillness of a story that has reached its climax on paper but not yet in the room where it will actually be witnessed. The district attorney and Appo's office moved forward with its investigation, quietly, methodically, interviewing Danny, interviewing Dr. Anand, subpoenaing records from Care Alliance Advisory Partners and the Cedarview Holding Company. Marcus, through his attorney, declined to be interviewed without counsel present, which Harold told me, with a certain grim satisfaction, was itself a meaningful data point for the investigators. I moved back into my own house during those 8 weeks. The locks changed again, this time by me, with Harold and Appo's help securing an emergency trustee order restoring my full access. Marcus and Diane and Appo's renovation sat half-finished, a kitchen gutted and never rebuilt, the gold mirror still hanging in the front hall, which I finally took down myself and replaced with the wedding photograph of Walter and me that I found, still intact, in a box in Marcus and Appo's old closet, where it had apparently been stored rather than discarded. A small detail that told me something about my son I chose, for the moment, not to examine too closely. I did not speak to Marcus during those 8 weeks. He did not call. Diane called twice, both times with the careful, gentle tone of a woman trying to determine how much damage had actually been done and whether it could still be managed, and both times I told her calmly that any further conversation would need to happen through our attorneys. The gala approached the way large events always do, slowly, and then suddenly all at once. 3 days before it, Harold arrived at my house with a final folder, thicker than any of the others, and a look on his face that told me the investigation had reached exactly the point I had been waiting for. End quote. The DA and Appo's office is ready to move, end quote, he said. End quote. They have enough for formal charges, fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of an elder, against Marcus, Diane, Preston Duke, and the neurologist. They and Appo's been holding, waiting to see if you wanted the arrests to happen quietly, before the gala, or, end quote. End quote. No, end quote, I said. End quote. Let them wait until after. End quote. Harold looked at me for a long moment. End quote. You want it to happen at the gala itself? End quote. End quote. I want the truth to happen at the gala, end quote, I said. End quote. What happens after that is not mine to control, and I and Oppos V made my peace with that. But I intend to be the one who says it, Harold. Not a subpoena delivered quietly to a man in Oppos' office. Not a headline he reads over coffee. I intend to stand in that ballroom in front of everyone who built that company alongside Walter and me, and tell them in my own words exactly what has happened, and let my son hear it the way I heard it, standing on my own porch holding a suitcase I didn't and Oppos' T-pack. End quote. Harold nodded slowly, and I saw in his expression the particular respect of a man who had spent 40 years watching me build something patiently, and understood at last that I intended to finish it the same way. End quote. Then I and Oppos LL make sure the DA and Oppos' office is standing by, end quote, he said, end quote, the moment you and Oppos ready, end quote. The Hale Distribution Group 40th Anniversary Gala was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Kestrel Hotel downtown, the same hotel where Marcus and Diane had married 11 years earlier, a detail I noted without comment when I saw it printed on the event program. 412 guests, according to the final count Harold and Oppos' office received from the planning committee, executives, board members, longtime employees, suppliers who had worked with Hale Distribution since the early warehouse days, a handful of local officials, and seated at the head table my son in a suit tailored for exactly this evening, prepared to stand at a podium and introduce himself as the face of the company and Oppos' next 40 years. I arrived quietly in a dress I had owned for 6 years, escorted by Claire and Robert on one side and Danny on the other, and took a seat near the back of the ballroom, at a table I had specifically asked to be seated at, among a handful of the oldest Hale Distribution employees, men and women who had worked the warehouse floor in the earliest years, who remembered better than almost anyone else in that room exactly whose hands had built the company from 11,000 borrowed dollars. Marcus did not see me arrive. He was occupied at the head table, greeting board members, laughing at something a state senator said, entirely visibly at ease, a man standing at what he believed was the beginning of his triumph. Dinner proceeded. Speeches began. The current board chairman, a longtime friend of Walter and Oppos' named Eugene Marsh, spoke movingly about the company and Oppos' history, about Walter and Oppos' original vision, about the values of hard work and integrity that had built Hale Distribution from a single rented warehouse into a regional institution. He did not mention my name once, and I noted it without bitterness, merely as a fact, one more small piece of evidence of exactly how thoroughly I had, for 40 years, chosen invisibility. Then Marcus rose to speak. He was good at it, I will grant him that, even now, even knowing everything I knew by that point. He spoke about his father with what sounded, to anyone who hadn't and Oppos' spent the last 5 months uncovering the true shape of his ambitions, like genuine grief and genuine pride. He spoke about continuity, about honoring a legacy, about the responsibility he felt, as Walter Hale and Oppos' son, to carry the company forward into its next chapter. End quote. My father built this company from nothing, end quote, Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom and Oppos' sound system, end quote, and I intend to spend the rest of my career making sure his vision continues to guide everything we do, end quote. I rose from my table before he had finished the sentence. I had not planned exactly what I would say, walking up the center aisle of that ballroom in a 6-year-old dress, past 400 faces turning, one by one, to watch a quiet widow they mostly recognized only vaguely, if at all, walk toward the front of the room where her son stood at a podium mid-speech. I had planned instead to trust the same instinct that had carried me through 40 years of difficult rooms, the instinct that told me simply to speak the truth clearly, and let the truth do the rest of the work. Marcus saw me when I was halfway up the aisle. I watched his face change. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that flickered very briefly, into fear before he smoothed it back into composure. End quote. Mom, end quote. He said into the microphone, his voice carrying an edge of forced warmth. End quote. I didn't and Oppos' know you were coming tonight. Everyone, this is, end quote. End quote. I know who I am, Marcus, end quote, I said. I did not need the microphone. The room had gone quiet enough by then, that my voice carried on its own. End quote. I think it and Oppos' time this room did too. End quote. I reached the front of the ballroom. Marcus stepped back from the podium uncertain, and I stepped forward and took his place, looking out over 400 faces I had spent 40 years quietly, deliberately avoiding. End quote. My name is Eleanor Hale, end quote, I said. End quote. Most of you know me, if you know me at all, as Walter and Appo's widow. A few of you might remember me from the early years, when Walter and I ran the warehouse together, before the company grew large enough that I stepped back from the day-to-day, and let my husband become the face of what we had built. I want to tell you tonight in front of all of you exactly why I stepped back and exactly what has happened since. End quote. I told them everything. Not with anger. I had promised myself that walking up that aisle, and I kept the promise, though it cost me something to keep it. I told them about the 50-50 partnership Harold Weiss had structured in 1976 at my insistence, because I had done the arithmetic and knew exactly how much of the company and Appo's survival depended on decisions I had made. I told them about the family trust built over 4 decades that controlled the majority of Hale Distribution Group, and about the true scope of what that trust held, a scope I watched register in real time across the faces of board members and executives who had spent years assuming they understood the full shape of the company they worked for. I told them about Walter and Appo's death and about the locks changed on my own front door 3 days later. I told them about the $20 under the Flowerpot. I told them about the power of attorney signed at a hospital bedside, and the shell consulting company built to drain funds from it, and the retirement community secretly owned by the same consultant who had helped architect the entire plan. I told them about the forged medical letter from a doctor whose license had been suspended for exactly this crime, and about the corroborating letter from my daughter-in-law and Appo's own uncle, a man who had examined me exactly once for a sinus infection. The ballroom had gone entirely, completely silent. I could see, in the faces closest to the podium, the particular stillness of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about the family whose company they had gathered to celebrate. End quote. I want to be clear about something, end quote, I said, looking for the first time since I and Appo's begun speaking directly at Marcus, who stood a few feet away, his face gone the color of old paper. End quote. I do not tell you this tonight out of a desire for revenge. I tell you because I spent 31 years raising a son I believed understood the difference between what he was given and what he was owed, and I discovered 5 months ago that he did not. And I believe, having built something honest over 40 years with my late husband, that the people who have trusted this company with their careers and their livelihoods deserve to know the truth about who is asking to lead it next. End quote. I looked back out at the room. End quote. The district attorney and Appo's office has, as of this evening, filed formal charges against my son, against his wife, and against 2 other individuals who assisted them, for fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of an elder. I understand there are officers waiting outside this ballroom to make those arrests, as soon as I finish speaking, because I asked that they wait until I had said what I came to say in my own words, in front of all of you, end quote. The gasp that moved through the ballroom was audible, a single collective intake of breath, and I saw at the edge of the room 4 uniformed officers step through the main doors, moving quietly without urgency toward the head table. Marcus did not run. I will say that for him, in the years since, whatever else he had become, in that final moment, standing in front of 400 people who had gathered to celebrate a legacy he had tried to steal, he did not run. He stood very still, his face gone entirely blank, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, not in 31 years of raising him, something that looked, finally, almost like the beginning of shame. End quote. Mom, end quote. He said quietly, so quietly I doubt more than a handful of people near the podium heard it. End quote. I didn't, and Appo's think you and Appo's actually, end quote. End quote. I know, end quote, I said. End quote. That was always the mistake, Marcus. Nobody ever thought I actually would. That was never a weakness. It was the only advantage I ever needed, end quote. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, at the table I had shared with the oldest of Hale Distribution and Appo's employees, I heard a woman begin quietly to applaud, one of the original warehouse crew, a woman named Dolores Fain who had worked the loading dock alongside Walter and me back when the whole operation fit into a single rented building. The applause spread from her table outward, slowly at first, uncertain, and then more fully, not raucous, not celebratory in the way applause usually is at a gala, but something quieter and more deliberate, the sound I understood of people who had spent decades assuming they knew the whole shape of the company they and oppose, given their working lives to finally applauding the part of the story they had never been told. The officers reached him a moment later. I did not watch them lead him out. I turned instead and found Claire and Oppo's face in the crowd and Danny and Oppo's beside her and walked back down the center aisle of that ballroom the same way I had walked up it, steadily without hurry, the way I had learned across 68 years that dignity is best carried quietly and entirely on your own terms. Diane was arrested the following morning, at the house that had once been mine, in the middle of the half-finished kitchen renovation she had been so eager to complete. Preston Duke was located 4 days later, attempting to transfer funds out of Care Alliance Advisory Partners and Oppo's accounts before Harold and Oppo's emergency freeze had fully taken hold, an attempt that failed, and that added an additional charge of attempted obstruction to the case already building against him. The neurologist whose license had been suspended 8 years earlier was arrested in another state, where the district attorney and Oppo's office discovered in the course of their investigation that he had used the same fraudulent template in at least 4 other guardianship cases across 3 states over the preceding 6 years, exploiting in total families whose elderly relatives had trusted the wrong people at the most vulnerable moment of their grief. The trial, when it came 8 months later, was not the drawn-out spectacle the local papers seemed to hope for. Marcus and Oppo's attorney, faced with the forensic evidence Harold and Oppo's investigator had assembled and the financial trail Danny had helped trace, negotiated a plea agreement rather than risk a jury hearing the full scope of what had been done. Marcus pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery, and received a sentence of 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months given the absence of any prior record and what his attorney described, not entirely inaccurately, as in, quote, a pattern of behavior driven more by opportunity than by inherent malice, end quote. I did not attend the sentencing. Claire went and told me afterward that Marcus had looked, standing before the judge, smaller than she had ever seen him, not performing contrition for once but genuinely visibly diminished by the full weight of what he had done finally landing on him in a room he could not talk his way out of. Diane received a shorter sentence, having cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for testimony against Preston Duke, whose own trial, held separately, resulted in the longest sentence of anyone involved, a reflection, the judge noted at his sentencing, of the fact that he had built and sold this exact scheme knowingly to multiple families across multiple states, understanding fully each time the devastation it would cause. I did not visit Marcus in prison during those first 18 months. I wrote to him twice brief letters not of forgiveness which I was not yet ready to offer but of information, that his sons were safe, that Claire had begun taking Tyler and Cole to the rail yard on Saturdays where Hale Distribution and Oppo's oldest trucks were kept restored as a kind of living museum of the company and Oppo's earliest years, that I had repaired the porch railing he and Oppo's never gotten around to fixing, that I still went to church every Sunday, and that I still on quiet evenings spoke to his father and Oppo's photograph the way I had every evening for years, because grief, it turned out, did not resolve itself simply because the person you loved had also, eventually, hurt you. He wrote back the second time, a longer letter than I expected. He did not make excuses in it, which surprised me more than anything else he said. He wrote about the years after Walter and Oppo's health began declining, about a private terror he had never told anyone about, a fear, he said, that he had spent his entire career being handed opportunities rather than earning them, that he did not know, underneath the confidence he and Oppo's learned to perform, whether he was actually capable of building anything real on his own, and that somewhere in that fear, he had convinced himself that taking control of what his parents had built was not theft but simply claiming early what would eventually have been his anyway. I told myself a story where I was the responsible one, he wrote, protecting the family from decline, protecting an inheritance from being lost to bad decisions. I built that story carefully enough that I believed it myself most days. It took watching you stand at that podium, telling 400 people the truth in your own voice, to understand that the only decline in this family was the one I was causing. I did not answer that letter for 3 weeks. When I finally did, I wrote only a few lines, that I had read it, that I believed he meant what he and Oppo's written, and that belief was not the same as trust, and that trust, if it was ever rebuilt between us, would have to be rebuilt slowly through years of actions rather than a single letter, the same patient way everything worth having had ever been built in our family. I sold Hale Distribution and Oppos' controlling public stake 2 years after the gala, not out of any bitterness toward the company itself, but because I had by then spent enough of my life managing it quietly from the background, and I wanted in whatever years remained to me something simpler. I kept the family trust intact, restructured with Harold and Oppos' careful help into a form that no single person ever again could hold sole authority over. A board of independent trustees, Claire among them, alongside 2 longtime Hale Distribution executives whose integrity I had watched quietly for decades, and Danny, who left his entry-level finance role and took a permanent position helping oversee the trust and Oppos' philanthropic arm, which I expanded significantly in Walter and Oppos' name, to fund exactly the kind of independent legal advocacy that had helped save me resources for elderly people facing exactly what I had faced, families torn apart by exactly the kind of quiet patient exploitation that had nearly cost me everything. I moved back into the house on Elm Street permanently, the porch railing repaired, the dogwood tree Walter had planted the year Marcus was born still standing, a little taller each spring. I did not put a gold mirror in the front hall. I kept the wedding photograph exactly where it had always belonged. Claire and I speak every Sunday still, though the calls have a different quality now, easier, less careful, filled with the ordinary texture of a relationship no longer weighed down by things left unsaid. She brings Tyler and Cole by most weekends. I taught Cole, the summer he turned 8, how to balance a simple set of books, the same way my own mother taught me, at a kitchen table by lamplight, though ours admittedly has better lighting. Marcus was released after 19 months on parole and moved at first into a small apartment 2 towns over, working a modest job at a logistics company that had no connection to Hale Distribution and no idea, for the first several months, who he had once been on track to become. He did not ask to move back into any version of his old life. He asked instead carefully in a letter whether he might be allowed to visit his sons under supervision, and whether someday when I felt ready I might be willing to have coffee with him. Not to discuss the trust, not to discuss the company, simply to talk the way a mother and son might talk about ordinary things, the way we used to before everything else got in the way. We had that coffee, eventually, nearly a year after his release, at a small diner neither of us had any history with. Neutral ground, Harold called it, half-joking, though I understood the wisdom underneath the joke. Marcus looked older than his years, thinner, quieter than I remembered him being even as a boy. We did not resolve everything that first coffee, or the several that followed it in the months after. Some things, I have learned, are not resolved so much as they are slowly, patiently carried, the weight of them growing more bearable over years rather than disappearing entirely. End quote. I used to think, end quote, Marcus said at one of those later coffees, stirring a cup he and Oppos' let go cold without drinking, end quote, that you were just quiet, that you didn't and Oppos' have much to say most of the time, and that Dad was the one who really understood how everything worked. I never once, growing up, thought to ask you what you actually knew. End quote. End quote. I let you think that, end quote, I said. End quote. For a long time I preferred it that way. Felt safer being underestimated. People tell you the truth when they dawn, and Oppos' think you and Oppos' paying close enough attention to notice. End quote. End quote. And now? End quote. I considered the question, turning it over the way I turned over most things, slowly, carefully before answering. End quote. Now, end quote, I said, end quote, I and Oppos' discovered there and Oppos' a different kind of safety in simply being known. It took me 68 years and a great deal of difficulty to learn that particular arithmetic, Marcus. I hope it doesn't, and Oppos' take you quite as long. End quote. He nodded and did not say anything further, and for a moment, sitting across from him in that small diner with its ordinary coffee and its ordinary light coming through the windows, I let myself feel, without guilt and without excessive hope, something close to what I imagine other mothers feel when their children have simply grown up. Not triumph, not vindication, nothing so dramatic as either of those, but something quieter, and in its own way more durable. The possibility, still uncertain, still being built one ordinary conversation at a time, of a future between us that neither of us had earned yet, but that both of us finally understood the actual cost of. What I keep most of all is Walter and Oppos' watch on my nightstand, wound every morning out of a habit I have never quite let myself break. I bought a small boat that second summer, a modest thing with a reliable motor, nothing grand, and had the name painted on its stern in plain black letters. The Quiet Partner. Claire laughed the first time she saw it. End quote. Dad would have hated that name, end quote, she said. End quote, too on the nose. End quote. I told her that was exactly why I chose it, because for 40 years I had been precisely that, quietly on purpose, and I had decided it was finally time to let the name say so out loud, even if the only people who ever read it were the herons on Ellison Lake. I still go to church every Sunday. I still speak to his photograph some evenings quietly about ordinary things, the dogwood tree, the grandchildren, the particular satisfaction of a Wednesday afternoon spent teaching an 8-year-old the difference between an asset and a liability. I never told the congregation at St. Andrew and Appos the full truth of what I am worth, though most of them know it now, since the trial made the local papers for the better part of a season. A few people treat me differently because of it. More careful, more deferential, in ways that amuse me more than they flatter me. Most people, though, still greet me the way they always did, with the easy familiarity of neighbors who watched me hand out bulletins at the 80 and Appos clock service for 30 years, and I have come to understand that this, too, is a kind of wealth Marcus never learned to value, to be known plainly by people who have no reason to want anything from you. I still drive the same car I drove before any of this happened. I still don an Appos need anyone to look at me twice. But when they do now, I no longer feel the need to look away first. But I have learned, in the years since that gray Tuesday morning on my own front porch, that there is a considerable difference between choosing to be underestimated and being erased entirely, and that a woman who has built something real with her own hands over the course of an honest life owes it eventually, not to herself alone but to everyone who loved her honestly along the way, to stand up at least once, in a room large enough to hold the whole truth, and say clearly in her own voice, "This is what I built. This is who I am." And no one, not even the child I raised with my whole heart, gets to take it from me by pretending I was never here at all.